Last year, I showed you all this map of Africa from 1935 so that we could learn more about the colonial apparatus that had the continent in its grips at this time. And I thought this turned out to be a pretty good video, as it definitely got more views than most of my recent ones, so clearly you all did too. But I also got a lot of comments complaining that the video was too Eurocentric, which I guess is fair. For what was supposed to be a video about Africa, I did end up talking mostly about Europeans' actions here. But also, I mean, that was kind of the point, to illustrate how decisions made by European powers nearly a century ago continue to affect politics on the continent today. Though okay, yeah, sure, I get what you're saying. A map like this, with its colonial borders and colonial place names, completely fails to communicate anything about the people who actually lived here during this period. So I kept my eyes peeled, and sure enough, while on a trip to New Orleans last summer, I stopped by the Crescent City bookstore, where I found... What did I find? There it is. Can you see it? Crescent City bookstores. Oh, you can just barely see it. Let's take it out. Okay, you guys ready? Here we go. Oh! Okay, let's just try showing you all like this first. This is how it goes. That is a map of Africa if I've ever seen one. What did I find? I found this map titled Johnson's Africa. Dated to the year 1866, that makes this 69 years older than this, and places this map 20 years prior to the infamous Berlin Conference and the formalization of the scramble for Africa, giving us a glimpse of the continent mere moments before it would be forever altered by colonialism, when it was still home to its own kingdoms, caliphates, empires, nations, and more. So let's try this again and see what else we can learn about Africa circa 1866. Alright, how does this look? That looks good to me. Alright, just like last time, we're gonna start all the way up here in the northwestern corner of the continent. Today, this region doesn't really have a general name, at least not in English, but 150 years ago, this area was well known as Barbary. This name comes from the nomadic Berber people who have been known to live throughout these areas pretty much since time immemorial. Although this name has drifted out of use today, back when it was properly in use, Barbary was known around the world as a hub for piracy. The main business of the Barbary pirates, ironically enough, was the capture and trade of enslaved people they obtained by raiding villages along the northern coast of the Mediterranean. In the centuries prior to this map's making, over 1 million people were stolen from what would become Spain, France, and Italy, and sold in North African markets to Arab Muslim buyers. This is important to understand because the Barbary slave trade was one of the main justifications Europeans used to launch military campaigns of their own into these areas, as they saw conquering their opposing coastlines as the only way to defend themselves. Though by this time, the only European power to have succeeded at this was France, having secured Algeria 3 decades earlier. We can see this early form of French Algeria clung entirely to the Mediterranean coast, while it was the Sultanate of Morocco, or should I say Morocco, that had control over the interior at this time. On the other side of French Algeria lied the Beylik of Tunis, the precursor to the modern country of Tunisia. I called this a beylik because, well, that's what it was. This territory wasn't ruled by a sultan or a king, but rather a bey, and thus the state he governed was neither a sultanate nor a kingdom, but a beylik. When this map was printed, this title belonged to Mohammed as-Sadiq, perhaps better known as Sadoq Bey. Although he seems to have been a fairly progressive leader, enacting the Arab world's first constitution, creating a structured government that limited his own powers, Sadak Bey's reign would end 20 years after this with the signing of the Bardo Treaty, handing over power to the French. And I find it interesting that even before Africa's colonial period had really gotten underway, the states of the Barbary Coast were organized pretty much the same way they are now, something that might help explain the relative stability of these countries post-decolonization. Though moving east, we'll find what's now Libya was divided into two states, Tripoli and Fezzan, which if you ask me is a smart way to organize this region. The Tripolitanians shared a similar coastal identity, living in cities and farming what arable land there was, whereas the desert-dwelling Fezzan people lived completely different lifestyles, being a mostly nomadic, pastoral people. Seeing it like this, I hope you can begin to understand how making one country from what was once 2 or 3 unrelated territories has proven so problematic. Besides that, we'll find an Egyptian state very similar to the one that exists here today. The ruler at this time, however, was Ismail Pasha, whose title was also neither a sultan, king, or bey, but rather Khedive, making this the Khedivate of Egypt. While at this point it might seem like North Africa was home to all sorts of cool and uniquely native styles of governance, the truth is none of these states were actually independent, but rather they were all tributary states to the Ottoman Empire. That's what this red boundary indicates, the extent of Ottoman sovereignty, which was only broken by France's incursion into Algeria. To be honest, I'm not quite sure if the Ottomans' presence here counts as European colonialism per se, but it definitely was a form of foreign rule that had its base of operations pretty much in Europe, though at the same time, the Europeans certainly didn't see it this way, as they would later make it their goal to totally expel the Ottomans from the continent. Though at least when this map was made, this had not yet happened, and the Ottomans were simply in severe decline, which actually afforded these states a fair degree of autonomy. The Khedive of Egypt, for example, was independent enough to launch a military campaign of his own into neighboring Nubia, even so far as Sennar, on paper bringing these lands under Ottoman control, but functionally making them an Egyptian colony. To put it bluntly, the purpose of this conquest was again to amass slaves, as the ruling Khedive was hoping to raise an army of Nubian slave soldiers to fight against the Ottomans occupying his country, with the ultimate goal of achieving Egyptian independence once and for all. Beyond Nubia are several smaller states such as Darfur, Kordofan, and Sennar, each falling on different sides of red lines, which I hope illustrates how each of these areas hosted people from different ethnic groups who follow different religions and speak different languages. Nevertheless, these sultanates would eventually be grouped together with Nubia into the British Sudan colony, helping to explain why the modern country of Sudan continues to struggle with maintaining unity. In fact, you can actually see what were once the lands of Kordofan and Sennar lines up almost perfectly with the borders of the world's youngest nation, South Sudan. Meanwhile, what's left of Sudan is currently fighting another civil war, this time between East and West, or really between what was once Nubia and Darfur. Once again, I hope you can see how the historic divisions preserved on maps like this continue to affect the world today. Beyond the safety of the Nile, we'll find much of the African interior without many territorial demarcations. Of course, we know this area to be the largest expanse of rock and sand on the planet, so it makes sense that far less was known about it. Heck, an official name still hadn't even been settled on. As we can see, it was labeled both as the Sahara or the Great Desert. And isn't that funny? People used to simply call this the Great Desert, which I guess reveals how many perceived it at the time, the wall of sand at the footstep of the known world. Being aware of how truly vast and barren this area is, it's understandable nobody had mapped this desert in detail yet, and honestly, I'm impressed with the amount of detail that was included here. This area below Fezzan, for example, what's now northern Chad, was thought of as the country of the Tibu or Tida. Those names refer to the Tobu people who first settled in the Tibesti Mountains around 500 BCE and continue to inhabit these desert mountains to this day, meaning this part of the map remains impressively accurate. Below the Tibu is the name Kanem, no doubt a reference to the Kanem-Bornu Empire. In the distant past, Kanem had been one of the most powerful states in medieval Africa, having lasted in some form or another under the same Saifiya dynasty for nearly 800 years, making this one of the longest-lived empires in the continent's entire history. However, by this time, the Saifiya dynasty had been displaced by the rise of all these states to the south, and now a sheikh ruled over the country, bringing this period of Kanemi influence to an end. Then, further west were the lands of the Imoshach or the Tawarer. Although I didn't immediately recognize these names, after some thought I realized today we'd use the terms Amazigh or Tuareg to describe the people here. Related to the Berbers, the Amazigh are again a nomadic people who have traveled across these dunes for untold generations, and still do to this day. Immediately below them are the Air or Aspen people. Today, we understand this to be another branch of the desert-roaming Berber people, but specifically those who have taken up refuge within the Air Mountains, which offer a unique respite from the surrounding sand dunes, leading the Air people to develop their own sense of identity. Beyond that was the land of Azawad. This is yet another Tuareg term, this time meaning homeland, suggesting this is where many of the desert nomads originated. While some might try to fault this map for failing to define the boundaries between the Tibu, Tuaregs, Airs, and Amazighs, the truth is, as nomadic peoples who were constantly moving between the oases and wadis, there was no sense of land belonging to any one person or group, but rather whoever happened to be passing through at the time, making their nations practically impossible to define from a lines on maps perspective anyway. And so I'd argue that the lack of borders here is actually more accurate than any line in the sand European explorers could have drawn. Though once we cross the Sahara, we'll enter a region known at this time as Sudan, which appears to stretch the width of the continent. This might seem strange to some of you, as this name now is associated with just one or two countries, but before that, Sudan was the name attributed to the entire transition zone between the northern desert and the southern forests, an area we know now as the Sahel. Whatever you call it, crossing into the Sudan, farming becomes possible once more, leading to larger population centers surrounded by more organized states with well-defined territories. However, I'll admit I didn't really recognize many of these, as there aren't really any modern-day equivalents to them. This only made me even more curious, and digging a little deeper led me to learn these states were all the result of one of the single most impactful yet overlooked events in all of African history, the Fulani Jihads. Although Islam arrived to North Africa rather quick after its founding, as always, the Sahara posed an immense boundary for its spread any deeper into the continent. To make matters more difficult, the people on the other side of the desert looked completely different, spoke completely different languages, worshipped completely different idols, and had their own problems to worry about. Among them were the Fulani people, one of the many ethnic groups spread across West Africa constantly vying for control against the various other regional powers. However, with the introduction of Islam as a unifying force, the Fulani gained an upper hand against all the rest, allowing them to carry out a wave of religious expansions, or jihads, to establish several Islamic states all across the Sudan, or the Sahel. The state of Messina, for example, could more accurately be described as the Messina Caliphate, and occupied one of the most advantageous positions in the region, including the trading hub of Timbuktu, giving them control over trade routes in and out of the Sahara. Further east, there are even more states, such as Gondo, Sokoto, Bornu, Fombina, Adamawa, Bagirmi, Wade, and Darfur, all founded by Fulani jihadists within the century leading up to this. What makes the Fulani's adoption of Islam so significant is that although the religion had already been present among the Arabs of the continent, this was the first time ethnically sub-Saharan people were embracing the religion, and represented a foot in the door that could have led to the conversion of the rest of the continent. In other words, this was the moment Islam was starting to bridge the ethno-linguistic divide running through Africa, a true instance of cultural exchange. And this is important because the Christian nations of Europe definitely took notice of these jihads. This map is literal evidence of that, and viewed them as another threat to their strategic interests. Their thinking went that if Islam continued to gain power and influence throughout the continent, then so would their adversary, the Ottomans. Therefore, the only way to combat this would be to increase their own religious activity in Africa and start spreading Christianity instead. Which I'll admit is another insight I didn't really have until studying this map. Europeans were so threatened by the rise of these Afro-Islamic states that they launched their own crusades onto the continent with a virtually identical goal of not only conquering but converting new subjects. And I really want us to reflect on that for a second. How big a role religion, and specifically the tension between Christianity and Islam, played in the carving up of Africa. I feel like that's not discussed enough. Though now it's finally starting to make sense why so many zealous missionaries accompanied colonial projects. I also think this helps explain why none of these states are reflected in the modern borders of Africa, as this area was later conquered entirely by the French, who did their best to erase all memory of these early Islamic states. Though fortunately for us, you can't erase ink, so this paper has preserved a glimpse at an often forgotten chapter in Africa's history. Below this block of caliphates, we'll reach the coast of Guinea, where we'll find more countries outlined in red. The first is Senegambia. This may sound familiar, as this is where the modern countries of Senegal and Gambia are now found. However, this name, Senegambia, doesn't refer to any particular nation or state, but rather is a more general name for the region. Down here, we can even see the colony of Sierra Leone labeled within the region of Senegambia. However, as we can tell from names like St. Louis and Freetown, this corner of Africa was already interacting with Europeans and had been for centuries by this point. In fact, by 1866, the British had already carved their Gambia colony out of French Senegal, so I'm not exactly sure why this region has been left a single entity. Next to this is the country of Liberia, which was perhaps the newest and strangest nation in all of Africa by this point. Technically an American colony, Liberia was founded by runaway slaves and freed men escaping oppression in America in the lead up to the Civil War. In fact, now that I think about it, since the Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865, this being made in 1866 means that from this point on, Liberia would no longer be receiving freed African slaves, marking the end of its colonial period. It's hard to imagine what people would have thought about the creation of this new African state. Some saw it as an exciting experiment in the emancipation of enslaved people, while others saw it as a means of expelling those most likely to stir up a slave rebellion, therefore actually helping to uphold the institute of slavery. But whatever people thought, we can see there was considerable interest in this new nation, as it's the only country to have earned an entire expanded map up here, letting us see in detail the different Liberian states of Mesurado, Rassa, Sinu, and who could forget, Maryland. Liberia's president during this time was Daniel Bashir Warner, who stood as the continent's only democratically elected leader, though he too was technically a foreign ruler, having been born outside of Baltimore here in the US. Beyond Liberia, we'll find these three states included under a single red line: Ashanti, Dahomey, and Yariba. Of these, Ashanti was perhaps the most well-known, as it had organized itself into an empire prior to Europeans' arrival, and at the time of making this was under the rule of Kwaka Duopanan, an ambitious ruler dedicated to expanding the Ashanti domain into neighboring lands. This fighting spirit is what enabled the Ashanti to resist British colonial efforts on 4 separate occasions, starting in the 1820s, then the 1860s, 1870s, and 1890s, each time repelling British forces in a series of conflicts known as the Anglo-Ashanti Wars. It was only on their 4th and 5th campaigns in 1903 that the British were finally able to establish a foothold on the coast, and from there claim control over the Ashanti, making them one of the very last African nations to succumb to colonial rule. Though at the time this was made, only the First and Second Anglo-Ashanti Wars had been fought, resulting in what we see here, the fully independent nation of Ashanti. Next to that is the state of Dahomey. Now, we already learned about this kingdom a little in my previous video, but technically that was French Dahomey, whereas this is the independent kingdom of Dahomey, currently under the rule of King Glele, who presided over another incredibly wealthy African kingdom. Glele made his fortunes by launching raids into surrounding lands and bringing captured people back to coastal markets for sale to European merchant ships. And it was from the Dahomey slave markets that most Africans bought and brought across the Atlantic to America originated. In fact, King Glele oversaw the very last cargo of slaves ever brought to the United States aboard the Clotilda, which feels pretty significant if you ask me. Ironically, the end of the transatlantic slave trade is what ultimately weakened Dahomey enough for the French to step in and colonize them like all the rest. But at least here on this map, we can see Dahomey as it was in its full and final form. Though after looking at this part of the map for so long, I couldn't help but notice this curious detail as well, a mountain range known as the Kong Mountains, stretching from Senegambia all the way across Guinea. Of course, if you're familiar with the geography of Western Africa, you'll know there's no such mountain range spanning this part of the continent. So what's going on here? Well, if you'll recall, a few years ago I made a video about the search for the source of the Nile River, a quest that ended in the mythical Mountains of the Moon. Although the small Ruwenzori mountain range did end up fitting this description, legends of these mountains caused cartographers to blow them far out of proportion, eventually claiming they ran all the way across the continent, even into West Africa. At the same time, European explorers were also struggling to find the source of the Niger River and attributed their difficulty once again to locating these non-existent mountains. Although these were initially thought to be connected directly to the Mountains of the Moon, as more of the interior was explored, a massive continuous mountain chain became increasingly less realistic, and so eventually this feature had to be fractured, with the eastern half remaining the Mountains of the Moon and the western half now going by the Kong Mountains. Legends of the Kong Mountains persisted for the next 100 years as explorers continued to make fruitless attempts at penetrating the interior and locating the Niger's source. And I just love details like this so much, as they reveal how much mystery still surrounded this place, at least in the eyes of Westerners. After this is Yoruba, another African country not exactly represented by any modern borders. During this time, however, the Yoruba people were organized into what's now called the Oyo Empire, ruled not by a Bey or Khedive, but rather the Alafin. When this map was made, Olujide Adelu Ogunlowe was the Alafin in power, though he would soon hand rule over to his brother, Adeyemi Alowolodu, who would serve as the last sovereign ruler of the Yoruba people before the British came knocking, though at this time their main threat was still the neighboring Dahomey, who continued to raid their villages. Beyond the lands of Guinea were the lands of Lower Guinea, though separating them was this narrow strip of apparently unclaimed land, and I couldn't help but spot another curious detail here, as it's this river, the Liba River, that was used as the dividing line between these two regions. Following it from the Ghanaian coast, this river leads deep into the continent, to its source, the Liba Lake. The weird thing is, when I tried to find this body of water, there's nothing in this part of Africa. There is no Liba River and there is no Liba Lake. So it seems like what we have here is another feature imagined up by hopeful European explorers. Though unlike the Kong Mountains, I wasn't able to find anything written about this mysterious lost lake, and it seems like the myth of Lake Liba has faded from all popular memory. Though this is just the beginning, as if we look further inland, we'll find this massive basin has been outlined and labeled as the location of a supposed Great Lake of Africa. At first, I thought this might be an early interpretation of one of the actual Great Lakes of Africa, but further east we'll see them all already accounted for. Lake Albert, Victoria, Tanganyika, Malawi, everyone's here. So then this must be something else. Why they thought a massive lake existed at the heart of Africa is really anyone's guess, but I suspect it has something to do with explorers noticing just how huge and deep the Congo Basin was, and started theorizing there must be a lake somewhere at the bottom of it. Though unfortunately, I also couldn't find any mention of this supposed Great Lake online either, and not even other maps from a similar time featured it, so it must be a quirk of this map, which I think again helps illustrate how much remained unknown about Africa during this time. In fact, nearby we'll find another intriguing detail along the equator, where we can read this to be the probable direction of a great mountain chain. And I believe this to be a direct reference to the Mountains of the Moon. Thought to have been the source of the Nile for thousands of years, it appears this mythical mountain range was moved a bit further south in recent times to line up with the latest expeditions into the Nile's tributaries. And again, I just find details like this so fascinating. The idea that these mountains have existed in people's imaginations since ancient Egyptian times and were still being used on maps less than 200 years ago never ceases to amaze me. Continuing south along the shore, we'll enter the region known as Lower Guinea, where there's another series of coastal kingdoms. First is the kingdom of Loango, below that was the kingdom of Congo, then Angola, Bengay, Mozambique, Ovampo, Damara, and finally Great Namakwa land. I found this really interesting as I only recognized two of these names, Congo and Angola, which apparently were only some of the many kingdoms vying for regional dominance, though as we can see, by this time no one had really won out. It wouldn't be until the Portuguese empowered the king of Congo, known as the Manicongo, through trading guns in exchange for slaves that the Manicongo would gain the upper hand on his neighbors and establish Congo as the biggest regional power. At the time of our map's printing, the Manicongo on the throne was Pedro Elelo. As his name suggests, Pedro was a product of the Portuguese meddling that had been taking place here since the 1500s, and eventually would be the first Manicongo to submit to being a Portuguese vassal. The story is very similar for Angola, which until this point had always been a lesser African kingdom, at times even a tributary state to the Congo, that is until the Portuguese arrived and established their own colony here. Their purpose was again the acquisition of slaves to be brought to work on Brazilian plantations, leading Angola to launch numerous raids into the lands further south, expanding the colony of Angola until it had consumed the rest of these lesser states, erasing names like Bengay, Mozambique, Ovampo, and Damara from the map for good. Moving to the opposite side of the continent lands us in the Horn of Africa, where we'll find another significant state, Abyssinia, the predecessor to Ethiopia. Although the red line encircling it implies unity, for some reason Abyssinia is the only country to be broken up into its constituent territories. This may hint toward the fact that Abyssinia wasn't a true nation but rather an empire formed from the conquest of numerous small states. Commanding this collection of states was Emperor Tewodros II, or Theodore II, who worked hard with great success in the early years of his reign to reunite his country, but now his empire was crumbling as he struggled to resist British advances, and 2 years after the making of this, the emperor would take his own life with a pistol as British soldiers stormed his citadel during the Battle of Magdala. Beyond Abyssinia, we'll find the lands of Somalis, which has also been left colorless, seemingly implying this wasn't thought of as an organized nation yet, but rather a collection of people of similar ethnic groups, such as the Rahuan, the Marahan, the Wagadan, the Midjertain, and so on. Seeing how many different people groups shared these lands might help explain why the modern country of Somalia has struggled to maintain unity in the wake of decolonization. However, I was surprised to find that what's now the majority of Ethiopia was actually part of this green territory, Galas. Now, I'll be honest, not a lot of results came up when I googled this name, but once I realized Galas was an antiquated name for the Oromo people, it all started to make sense, as the Oromo are the largest ethnic group in the Horn of Africa and are a mostly nomadic people moving their herds of goats between different parts of the region. And I believe that's why Galas is not outlined in red, as the territory of the Oromo really was impossible to define back then, and so the best map makers could do was include the general area that they were known to be. Another example of how the language of the map actually provides us further insight into the ways of life of the people they depict. I also find it worth noting how what would eventually become Ethiopia was at this time split between at least 3 separate territories, mostly along ethnic lines, which I again can't help but feel provides us with some valuable insight into the inner tensions within Ethiopia today. Below this, we'll find the territory of Zanzibar clinging to the Swahili coast. Although I've never quite read this name before, I do know that not far offshore lies the island of Zanzibar, and I can't help but feel like these must be connected. At this time, Zanzibar was a bustling port made rich once again mostly through the dealing of slaves, taken from East Africa and bound for Arabia and beyond. This had been taking place for hundreds of years already, making the East African slave trade perhaps the oldest and largest operation of its kind on the continent, and at its heart was this island. However, this too had come under foreign rule in recent times, not by any European powers, but rather the Sultan of Oman, who commanded a rich mercantile empire all along the Indian Ocean. From this island, countless raids were launched into surrounding lands, extending Zanzibar's domain into what would become known as Zanzibar. And I think this is another too often overlooked chapter in Africa's history, as Arabs had been colonizing and slave trading in these parts for centuries by this point, while Europeans were still being terrorized by Barbary pirates. This is again worth noting because this horrible practice, the East African slave trade, was another moral justification Europeans eventually used to extend their own control into the region. Famous explorers like David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley dedicated their lives to the goal of ending the Zanzibari slave trade, only for their efforts to end up facilitating the further exploitation of these lands at the hands of new colonial masters. Though, at least here on this map, the name Zanzibar preserves the memory of these Omani slavers and helps shed light on a time and place in Africa's history too often overlooked. Beyond this lived the Unyamwezi and the Iloagab. I'll admit these names were another challenge to research, as I had to learn the hard way we now refer to these groups as the Nyamwezi and the Loikap, who still inhabit these areas today. Though if their territory's lack of color or definition on this map is any clue, I'm gonna go ahead and say neither were perceived as unified nations at this point, but rather decentralized communities. Continuing down the coast, we'll arrive at Mozambique, another name we should recognize, but as we can see, this version of Mozambique was much smaller than its modern form. Sadly, being directly south of Zanzibar, this area was subject to constant Arab slave raids, and so the area failed to develop any power structures of its own by the time the Portuguese staked a claim. Here, they established their own island foothold on the island of, you guessed it, Mozambique, from which they launched their own incursions into the interior and took their own slaves. But unlike the Arabs, after reaping a harvest of slaves, the Portuguese remained on these lands and tried starting new business ventures such as plantations, establishing the colony of Mozambique, which had already existed for 200 years by the time this map was printed. Below that are two more states I'm rather unfamiliar with, Monomotapa and Sofala. Though in my defense, Monomotapa is the outdated Portuguese term for what we now refer to as the Kingdom of Mutape. This was another rich and powerful pre-colonial African nation, and one of the surprising few whose wealth was attained not through the trade of slaves, but rather by operating a number of gold mines. Although this gave rise to a rich society based on something other than the exploitation of its own people, unfortunately these gold mines reminded Europeans of the legend of King Solomon's mines, another mythic land of gold similar to El Dorado, luring numerous expeditions into these lands in search of fortune and glory. Even though these searches for mountains of gold all ended in failure, the knowledge gained from these ventures again laid the groundwork for future colonization. But at least during this time, this afforded Monomotapa their own sovereignty. Sofala, on the other hand, is where all the Mutapan gold was brought for trade, painting an even bigger target on it. For a time, the Mutapa even ruled these lands directly as some kind of tributary state, but with the hopes of controlling the gold trade, the Portuguese gradually advanced into the lands of Sofala to expand their Mozambique colony. Even deeper in the interior, we'll find several more poorly understood states, such as the Londa Empire or the Makololo people. Occupying the rugged interior, these groups proved a challenge for Westerners to understand or define, as they too were often warring with one another for regional supremacy, causing land to change hands faster than explorers could report on it. So I understand why these areas were left vague and colorless. Another name I found interesting in this area is the Kazembe Reich, one more minor African kingdom that sadly fell victim to frequent slave raids. These raids forced the Kazembe people to flee their homelands and disperse more widely across the region, completely destabilizing the kingdom or Reich, which might help explain why their lands have also been left undefined. As to why it's been labeled a Reich, the German word for kingdom, remains a mystery to me, though if I had to guess, it probably has something to do with Germany's explorations of this region. But the German East Africa Company was only founded in 1884, well after the printing of this, so I'm not really sure what to make of it. Below the lands of the Kazembe and the Lunda were the Bechuanas, who also did not have a defined territory. However, this makes more sense when you understand that the Swana people's ancestral homelands were further south in what were then the countries of Transvaal, the Orange Free State, Natal, and Kaffraria. These weren't native African states, but rather were founded by the Boers, a group of Dutch settlers who arrived on the southern end of the continent 200 years before the making of this map. Initially, the Boers settled around the unpopulated Southern Cape, but eventually the British would take control over this strategic position, establishing their own Cape colony here. Unable to resist British aggression, the Boers fled the Cape for the interior, finding themselves on the lands of the Swana people. Here, they established a handful of their own states, in turn displacing the Swana to the north, resulting in no sort of organized state, but rather a collection of refugees thrust into a new land. If you'd like to see the Cape Colony in more detail, it's the third and final map inset up here, letting us once again see the individual states of the colony. While most of these aren't all that interesting, as they are again European-drawn administrative boundaries, I did manage to find one more neat name here, Great Bushman Land. This refers to the San people, otherwise derogatorily referred to as Bushmen, who represent a fascinating human lineage that can be traced back to the earliest humans to walk out of East Africa. Having maintained the same hunter-gatherer lifestyle as our ancestors, the various San people never organized into any formidable unified state, again resulting in Great Bushman Land lacking any kind of definition. But alright, that's pretty much the whole map. There are of course loads more names and places, but that was everything outlined and colored in. So what did we learn from all this? Well, if you ask me, I was surprised to find that even though the scramble for Africa is said to have started in the 1880s, as we can see from this map, Europeans, Arabs, and Turks had already been carving up this continent for centuries by this point. Yet it's also fair to say that by 1866, Africa was still a rich and complex place full of sovereign nations. Of course, I'm aware this was still made by Westerners. Heck, it was printed right here in New York. So I can't really say this comes from an authentically African perspective per se, but at the very least, the borders we saw, the names we read, and the history we learned was that of the people who actually lived here in the moments before Africa was forever altered by colonization. And I think that's what I love most about old maps like this. With nothing but ink on paper, the memory of long forgotten people and places has been preserved, providing us a window to gaze back in time with to see for ourselves what Africa was really like back in 1866. Hey everyone, I just wanted to let you all know that if you've been enjoying these clips from the past that I've been including and you wanted to see more of them, I recently launched a second channel called Archive Dive where I take a closer look at these old films. One of the programs I watched in preparation for this video was Jungle Yachts in the Belgian Congo, a record of the explorer Attilio Gadi's efforts to cross Africa in some of the most bizarre vehicles I've ever seen. If you enjoyed this video and want an even closer look at Africa from the past, make sure to check this out. I upload here 4 times a week, so if you're a fan of this channel and would like to continue learning with me, once again it's called Archive Dive, and there's a link in the description. You can also buy these 2 posters back here. They're both up on my store, link in the description as well. Check them out. But alright, that's it. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all soon.